Hi, and welcome to part 7 of the sequencer project. So today we're actually going to make a sampler. We're actually going to make sounds today. And we're going to do that in SuperCollider. So we can open up SuperCollider and boot our server. You can do that by going s.boot and evaluating that, or of course Apple B or Command B. Now, first thing we need to do is to grab a sound file from our hard disk and load it into a buffer. So the buffer basically just stores our sound file into memory, so it's much quickly accessed. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to use this global variable S1 for my first sound, and I'm going to say equals, and I'm going to create a buffer. Now, if you use buffer.read, it will read a sound file from your hard drive, your hard disk, into memory. Okay, the first thing we're looking for, and the nice IDE gives us arguments. It tells us what argument it's looking for. First argument we're looking for is a server name. Generally, it's S. That's our local server most of the time. And then the second argument is the path to the sound file, the path actually to the sound file on our hard drive. So a good place to go, something I like to do, is to go to Freesound. It's a nice little website where people upload sounds, freesound.org. And I happen to find these sounds here, these little sounds, alto saxophone sounds, very nicely uploaded for us by Rocker Man. Thank you. So I've downloaded those. And then an easy way to get the path in is to drag the sound file right into your SuperCollider window. If I drag that sound file right in there, it's going to print out the path there. So that's nice. And there's a number of different things you can do, but we're not going to actually use those arguments. We're just going to use the default for those, and we're just going to end it there. So basically, reading the server S, and that's a sample. And we can do another one. Let's do another one. We'll call it S2. And we'll say buffer. Okay, S. And then the path will be this one, number 2. Okay. Oops. All right. So if our server's booted, if we evaluate these two, you'll see in our post window here, it says buffer 1, et cetera, et cetera. Just shows, it acknowledges that we've loaded a buffer into memory. And now if now they're known as S1 and S2. So if we evaluate just this little bit here, S1, it tells us what it is. It's a buffer at number 0. It has 27,136 samples. It's 2 channels, 4-4-1, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now, that's important. It's a 2-channel buffer, so these are stereo files. So we'll have to make a stereo sampler, which is fine. But anyways, we'll talk about it. But you have to specify in your SynthDef whether it is 1 or 2 channels, the number of channels. That's hard coded. Okay, so let's go there. The second thing we need to do is actually make a SynthDef. So SYNTHDF. Okay, and we'll call it sampler. Okay, and I'm just going to set up the function, and then .add. Okay, so what do we need to do? There's a number of different ways you can sample in SuperCollider. I'm going to use a fairly simple one, and it's called playbuff. Okay, playbuff.ar. All right, so why don't I go ahead and just set up the playbuff, and then we can add the arguments and stuff later around this primary UGen. So number channels, like I said, these are stereo files. This is hard-coded. You can't change the number of channels as an argument. So you can say, for example, sampler stereo. Let's do that. A workaround really is to just use 2 different SynthDefs and just call those differently. So we'll call it sampler stereo. We'll say 2 number channels, 2. Buffer number, we're going to make now that you can make a variable. So we'll just say buff. Okay, and that'll be our argument. Okay. And sure, we can change the rate too. Make that an argument as well. And then okay, and then we're gonna make a control rate trigger here. All right, and this is just another way of talking about an argument. So I'm gonna do I'm gonna say t underscore tr dot kr. Okay, and that just now our argument's name here is slash t underscore tr. Okay, that's going to be our argument name, and our default value is going to be 0 because we don't want it to trigger right away. And then we'll have a really short lag time, and I'll explain this in just 1 minute after we get our arguments in. And we won't worry about the start position and the loop right now. What we all will do is done action, and we're going to have it kill itself, which is 2, so that we can re-trigger it every time. Okay, so let me back up a little bit. All right, so this play buffer object is going to play a buffer. It's a bit of audio we have stored into memory. It asks for the number of channels. That's our first argument there. Then it asks for the buffer number, which will be one of these two. And SuperCollider smart, so basically you can just say go to this buffer and it will just find the buffer number. Okay. And then the rate, which it plays back, 1 being normal speed, 2 meaning twice the speed, so it'll be really fast, or 0.5 would be half speed, etc., etc. So you can play the buffer back at a different speed. And then this here, which they're calling the trigger, right? They're calling it trigger, is basically if it's non-zero, it'll trigger this buffer. It'll trigger the play buff object to play. Okay, so right now I instead put an argument just like rate and buff. So let's set those up actually just so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm going to declare a bunch of arguments for my synth-def, arg. I'm going to say buff, and we won't know ahead of time what the buffer is, so there's no default for that. But the rate, we can make a default equals 0. Okay, and I think that's it for now. So now the rate can be determined by an argument from the outside, so I can change that rate as it's playing or when I launch it. The buff, it will be one of these buffer numbers. Now here is just like these. It's the same thing, except I'm declaring it all down here, and it's a control rate trigger. Basically, it lets me use a signal instead, so that ttr.kr. Okay, so then the name instead of rate or buff will be this ttr. Okay, will be this ttr. That's the name of my argument. Okay, and then the first argument in this argument, I guess, the first item is the default value. So just like rate is going to default to 1. I'm sorry, not 0. Otherwise, it won't play at all. It's going to be off, 0. So it won't trigger when I launch it. It'll wait for a trigger message. So once it receives something non-zero, it'll trigger this buffer. Basically, it's just, it's exactly what it is, a trigger. But I have to use the rubric TTR to trigger it. Okay, and then this is the lag time, basically how long to wait before you actually implement that argument. Okay, or you implement over a certain amount of time. So I made it really, really short. And then done action there basically means that once this play buffer is done playing all the way through, what happens? Now 2 happens to be, SuperCollider has a number of actions. So 2 happens to be kill the synth. So basically, we won't have a bunch of stray synths lying around. It'll play the buffer, and then it'll go away. It'll just disappear. And that's what we want, essentially. All right, so we're essentially almost there, I think. Let's set up a variable for this. So we're going to call it var. We'll call it sampler. We'll call it samp. And then we'll just say samp equals. Okay, so we can just have it on a separate line, more for tidiness. And then we're going to send that out. And we probably should have an amp argument, just in case it's loud or soft. We want to change that. And we'll be careful with your amplitudes. Now, we just have to send that out to our basically our sound card, our speakers. So we're going to go out.ar, and what bus we're going to send it out? Well, we started out 0, which is our left channel, and if it's a stereo, for example, it'll automatically send it out 0 and 1. And then the channels array, meaning what are we actually sending out? Our speakers or a private bus, but we can talk about that later. Samp, okay, and that's that play buffer. So it's going to play our buffer out to our speakers, and that's us done there, I think. So let's add that. Okay, now let's just try it out to see if it actually plays something. And so we'll say a equals synth. We're creating an instance of this synth called sampler stereo. Okay. And if you want to declare some arguments there, which we have to do because it doesn't know which buffer we're trying to play, we use these square brackets, right? An array of arguments. And the first argument we have to declare is the buff. And that's going to be one of these above. So it's going to be S1 maybe. Okay, and do we need to declare anything else? Rate or amp? Not really. We'll just leave that the way it is. So if we trigger that, it should play our thing. And if you notice, if I do this and just shows, so there's nothing there. So it's got, you know, see synth sampler stereo was at node 1001. Well, once it was done playing, it's gone. So it kills itself. So I don't have to worry about a bunch of synths just piling up, not doing anything and taking up my CPU power. Okay, so that works. So this is just a tester there. We'll comment that out. Now, finally, that's pretty good. Let's go ahead and save that. Now, finally, and you see how easy that is. I have just a few lines of code, and I've made myself a nice sampler. Now we need the sampler to be triggered. So we're going to create an OSC, Open Sound Control enabled trigger. So basically we have to receive Open Sound Control messages and basically do what I did here and run that line of code. So basically create a synth that will play the sampler and depending on which one I want. All right. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to use this UGen called OSCDef, or object. I'm not sure if it's UGen, it's an object. And then the key really is just this name. So in the same way I said A equals synth, or S1 equals buffer, OSC just embeds that into its syntax, I guess. So, but we use a symbol notation, so I can say it and call it samp1, maybe something like that. That's just the name. That's the internal OSC language. SC language, supercluster language name. All right, so that doesn't really refer to anything outside, but I can kill it or do different things by calling it by that name. Okay, and then it's just looking for a function. Basically, everything in these curly brackets will be run when it receives the message. And then the next one, the path, is what message am I looking for? So I think in processing, we call that samp on, right? And we can double check that. And that's it, basically. So I can just compact into one line. So what are we going to actually do in this function? So when I receive the samp on, it runs everything in these curly brackets. What am I going to actually do? Well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do what I just did manually. I'm going to call an instance of this synth def sampler stereo, and I'm going to have it play this buffer. Okay. So we'll copy that bit of code right in there, and basically it runs. And this is why we need it to be done action 2, because every time it receives a thing, it'll trigger that. But then if we don't do done action 2, kill the synth, there'll be, dozens, if not hundreds of little synths just lying about on my server, not doing anything. Okay, so basically it'll play the sample and get out. Easy enough. So let's evaluate that, and we see from the post that it's all good. Great. Now this is ready to play, really. So let's go ahead and open up our sampler. And that's our processing sketch. Let's run it. Oh, of course, I have to, excuse me here, I have to just adjust my network settings. Okay, see, we have it running there. Okay, and let's pop a sample there, a sample there. Let's see what happens. Great, so it works. All right, fantastic. Okay, so I think I'm going to wrap things up right there and just review with you what we did here. The supercluster part side actually turned out to be quite easy and efficient. You see just a few lines of code and you have a pretty effective sampler there. I mentioned about loading buffers and how to find them at Freesound. I mentioned about creating a synth-def. Now, I do have separate tutorials. Well, I will have, hopefully soon, separate tutorials that address all the sort of the technical details of what all these things are. But I'm presuming that you have a basic knowledge of SuperCollider, what a synth-def is and what some of these variables and such are. So I've created a synth-def, and I've used this playBuff object, 2 channels, and I've created a number of arguments that are going to do all my work for me. One is the buffer that it's going to play. One is this, it's seemingly complicated, but really not that complicated control rate argument that I've created so that it can trigger it. And then I've created a done action too. All right, and right, and then I made an OSC def to respond to this SAMP-on message, and it's just going to trigger this sampler. And then we just ran it in processing. It works like a charm. That's great. So I'll wrap that up. And next time, maybe just one more in this project, we'll show you some bells and whistles, just give you some ideas about how to sort of enhance the sequencer. I might not implement everything. Maybe just toy around with a few things and see if we can make it even better or more, do more.